Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Ed Hand, your host for tonight's Unpublished TV panel discussion. Our topic tonight, the prorogation of Parliament and if it should be eliminated. However you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or on our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you can still cast your vote on this topic at Unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Our question this week: should the act of proroguing Parliament be eliminated? At Unpublished.vote, you'll find our podcast on the issue, as well as articles, opinion pieces, and research on prorogation. So let's get started. When we asked you, should prorogation be eliminated on Unpublished.vote, just over 70% said yes, 23% said no, and 6% were unsure. Now, joining us this evening to discuss prorogation of Parliament, Dr. Laurie Turnbull, the director of the School of Public Administration and an associate professor of political science at Dalhousie University, and Tim McSorley, national coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, also served as coordinator with Voices Coalition, which defended the right to democratic rights in Canada. And we'll start off with you, Laurie. Is there a place and time for proroguing?
It's a tough one, right? Like, I think prorogation has gotten a bit of a bad name in the sense that some prime ministers have relied on this as a political tool rather than as something that is seen as routine or necessary or kind of part of parliamentary procedure. I think probably the 2008 prorogation, that's when Prime Minister Harper was in office, and it was a really kind of charged up one in the sense that the prime minister knew that he was going to be facing a confidence vote. He was probably going to lose it. He was almost definitely going to lose it. And so prorogation at that time was kind of held up as a very political way of getting around something that he didn't want to confront. And in a way, it was seen as silencing the House of Commons at a time where they very much wanted to express themselves. And so I think that even though every prorogation is not that, and it's not kind of that kind of very stark terms and that kind of consequences at the same time, it's that situation has made the term prorogation, for those who are really aware of it and in tune with it, have a bit of a negative connotation. It's hard to make the argument, I think, that any time that a prorogation is absolutely necessary, right? Because a prorogation is just stopping parliamentary procedure. It doesn't dissolve Parliament. It doesn't change the composition of Parliament. It doesn't change the composition of committees. It means that everything that they're working on just stops. And then it's picked up again at a later time. And so when would that be necessary, right? And like, prorogation ends up stopping a session of Parliament and then triggering a speech from the throne. If a government really wants a speech from the throne that bad, a prorogation makes that happen. But do you need a speech from the throne? Is it, I mean, on some level, sure, it opens up a new set of priorities, and it introduces a new mandate, and it introduces a new agenda. Do you need a speech from the throne to do that? Probably not. So I think from the perspective of, do we need it, that question is really difficult to ever answer in the affirmative. Is it the prime minister's prerogative to do it? Is it his right to do it? That kind of thing. That's a different kind of question.
Well, that's his right to ask for it. It doesn't automatically mean he'll get it, right? That's the Governor General who decides that.
Yeah, and that was the issue in 2008. Right?
Yeah.
Like, is there a sense that the prime minister has to be obeyed? And I think if it's a majority government prime minister, then the prorogation or any other request is kind of open and shut. But if it's a minority government prime minister, then it's not so much. If the minority government prime minister doesn't have absolutely a strong sense of the confidence of the House, then it's not necessarily the case that every request would be granted.
Tim, do you feel prorogation circumvents democracy?
I think it does. As Laurie pointed out, it's a very symbolic act. It's not really clear why current and modern, even constitutional democracies and Westminster democracies like ours need to continue with prorogation. And even though it's not always and doesn't necessarily even have a long history of being used to circumvent, accountability and transparency, it can definitely be used that way. And we've seen that with both liberal and conservative governments. In 2008, there was the Afghan detainee scandal that was heating up, and it essentially disappeared and ended up resulting in a very milquetoast, dismissive report eventually by the Liberal government, but it never really led to the answers that people were asking for and demanding at the time. And now we see, I wouldn't say the WE scandal is as, I, I'm not as furious about the We scandal as I am about the detainee scandal, but at the same time, again, it's an example of why should the government have this power if it means that it allows them to avoid accountability and transparency?
Yeah, exactly. Now, Laurie, why is it allowed to avoid a confidence vote?
Okay, so like I don't think there's nothing in the books that says, a prorogation is here for these political purposes. And if you press the prorogue button, it allows
Mhm.
you to avoid these things, right? It's not that. It's that a prorogation, I think, like if we were to kind of roll back the tape several centuries, right? Like there's nothing particularly pure in a parliamentary sense about prorogation. There's nothing in the parliamentary regime that requires a prorogation, nothing at all. It's just a sense that I think earlier in British history, there was a king who came up with this idea because he really liked the assembly that he had at the time. And rather than dissolve the assembly and have them, run the risk of having an election of an assembly that didn't agree with him, to prorogue it and bring back the same membership was quite conducive to his purposes because he was able to bring back a group of people who were able to who seemed to be quite inclined to pass what he wanted to pass. And so back when monarchs, kings actually had quite a bit of a role to play in terms of policy and parliamentary outcome, it made sense for a king to have an assembly that was in line with him. Now, obviously, we're quite a bit past that. And so one could make the argument on that basis alone that prorogation makes much less sense because it's not like to summon and dissolve parliament is one thing. Somebody has to bring parliament together. Somebody has to dissolve parliament so that there's an election and then there's an election of a new parliament that has the confidence of the people and that can then choose a government, right? Like those sorts of things make parliamentary sense. Is there parliamentary sensibility to stopping parliament for a period of time? I think it's harder to make that argument, especially when we can stop Parliament for a summer session, for instance, and not totally prorogue the thing. And like that,
Mhm.
there's different ways of kind of going about that. But I think, I mean, like to try to make the argument that prorogation has some sort of really existential purpose in parliamentary health is a hard argument to make.
Mhm.
I mean, you're not, and there's no sense that a prime minister is owed this, and that a prime minister is entitled to somehow escape a confidence vote. Like, not at all. And that's not the point of any of it. To the contrary, the point of a parliamentary system is to make sure that the prime minister and the cabinet are held accountable. And so, to the extent that any instrument makes that harder, is seems to me at odds with the purpose of parliamentary government in the first place.
And we've got a question coming in from one of our YouTube viewers. What impact will this proroguing of Parliament have on Parliament once it returns in October, Laurie?
It's interesting. Like on some level, when it could have a whole lot of impact or not a whole lot. Like when we see Parliament come back on September 23rd, there will obviously be a speech from the throne because that's necessary. It will allow the government to put forward a set of priorities that it didn't have before, and the government will justify that because of COVID, right?
Mhm.
Because all of the priorities that I set out in October, November of 2019 have been turned on their head because of the realities of COVID, and they need to be able to reset. And that'll be the kind of the line of argument that we see, I think. And also, not only just that, not only the COVID situation, but also there's been a lot of changes on the benches of the Trudeau government itself. The fact that we have a new finance minister, that's a significant change. And so they might want to have the opportunity to press reset on that level as well. I think the government will be looking, as as we've talked about a little bit before, to take the story away from the we issue and to
Mhm.
reset around how are we going to rebuild post COVID. Also, because there's a new leader of the opposition, Aaron O'Toole will be looking to put his own vision forward and how Canada should rebuild post COVID, and that will be, I think, in stark contrast to what Minister Freeland wants to do. And so that's how we'll see that. I think the prorogation is
Okay.
giving an opportunity for everybody to say, okay, what are we going to do now? And how much that we story survives, it might not change anything. If the opposition can continue to press on those documents, to press on the, whether or not that redaction was appropriate, like the opposition has not been silenced. It's just been taken out of the
Mhm.
parliamentary context. And so to the extent that they can keep that narrative going, it could be a very, very charged environment when we come back in September.
Tim, what do you think about the impact once Parliament returns in October?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we're concerned at the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group right now, it's about some of the one bill in particular, but we could say in general the bills that were still left on the table when prorogation was called. And one that hasn't moved forward is Bill C3, which was meant to finally bring in an independent review and complaints body for the Canada Border Services Agency, which is being, basically a call since it was created in the early 2000s that there's no independent review for essentially the police force that monitors our border. And so we don't know what's going to happen with that bill. We don't know if it's going to move forward as is. Our hope, and we've reached out to the government, is that they might actually listen to some of the critiques that came up over the summer and introduce maybe an even better bill that responds to some of those concerns. But that's the type of thing that we just don't know is going to happen, and that serves as collateral damage when prorogation is called. We don't know what happens to the legislation that is important and meaningful and might never make it through Parliament now.
You're watching Unpublished TV as we discuss proroguing Parliament and is there a need to eliminate it. Joining us this evening, Dr. Laurie Turnbull. She's the director of the School of Public Administration, associate professor at Dalhousie University, and Tim McSorley, national coordinator, International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, as we discuss proroguing. And we talk about, I guess it's the minority government that's always going to be the one dealing with walking a fine line with proroguing, right? If you've got the majority, it doesn't matter whether you prorogue it or not, right, Laurie?
I mean, like, it can still be seen as not a great thing to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, even in a majority government situation, and I think Chrétien was always in a majority government situation, and so to the extent that a majority government can kind of pull the plug on parliamentary scrutiny because something might cost them in the next election, because something might draw embarrassment, like on some level, like, no, it might be hard to kind of find a justification for that. On the other hand, if a government is in a majority situation, there's a sense that they have the mandate a bit in a stronger sense to do what they want to do, what they need to do. And then, but at the same time, I'm not really sure that always resonates with voters. Like, I think sometimes, even if there's a majority government that is kind of leaning on the public patience, even though there's a majority support in the House, even though that doesn't present a problem from a constitutional perspective, it can sometimes present a problem in a political perspective, in the sense that a government might be like, anytime a government looks like it's trying to silence criticism in Parliament, that can create a legitimacy crisis.
Tim, do you find it hypocritical? The Liberals went and prorogued despite, going back to 2015, their election promise not to, and all the complaining they did about Mr. Harper?
It's definitely hypocritical in the sense that they did it now. If they were just proroguing at this point and we weren't seeing the weed scandal and there weren't other questions swirling around them, it wouldn't be great, but it wouldn't necessarily be hypocritical because they wouldn't be using it to avoid a scandal. But what we're seeing right now is that there was no reason to prorogue for the amount of time they're proroguing for. At the exact moment when these documents were going to be revealed to the committee and shared with the committee. It's true that, as Laurie pointed out, the committee can keep pushing and opposition can keep pushing the issue. It doesn't stop them from talking about it, but it definitely, there's definitely a whiff of hypocrisy around this, and that they promised to not do this, that they promised to set another standard, and they haven't lived up to that.
I'm wondering, and it seems every time we talk about proroguing, whether it was with Trudeau, whether it's with Mr. Harper, going back to Mulroney and even in Chrétien, what were the differences between when Mulroney prorogued and we'll say Harper in 08, 09?
I think the big thing that made the 08 prorogation a thing, right, even apart from the 09 prorogation,
right,
it wasn't that it was Harper. It was that it was the sequence of events. So in 2008, we had a general election in the fall. The Harper Conservatives came back with a minority government. Okay. We had a fiscal update in November of that year. Nobody had mentioned anything about the three issues that were coming up with a fiscal update. And so particularly this issue around taking the public funding, the per vote subsidy, away from political parties. And so that issue that the Conservatives brought forward, the other parties felt blindsided by that and thought, you know what, you didn't campaign on this. We didn't talk about this. You're pulling the rug from under the political parties in terms of public finance. Now, there's a whole argument to be made around that and how much else the parties get in terms of public funding. But at the same time, that was sort of the crux of the argument at the time. And so the other party says, we're not going to support this, right? Like, and we've just gone to election. The election produced a conservative minority. If you people can't hold the confidence of the House, we have an alternative government. So the proximity of that particular conversation to the previous election was very important, in the sense that we hadn't gone very long, right? And the House had not produced a majority government. And there was a sense that if the Prime Minister could not keep the confidence of the House, it had been so close to the previous election that the other side of the House should be given an opportunity to form government. And there was a sense of a constitutional, like people like me, people who talk about this stuff all the time, there was a sense that, okay, that's kind of true, right? Like if the Prime Minister comes back, they can't hold confidence for long, rather than go to election right away. The Prime Minister is not entitled to an election just because this fiscal update's not going to go through because of the proximity to the previous election. There's a sense that we should give the other side of the House an opportunity to try. And then we see, at the time, the Liberal Party, the NDP, come up with this proposed coalition that, listen, you don't need to go to another election. Governor General, we're over here. We can offer an alternative government. Oh, okay. But the sense, this kind of Liberal NDP proposed coalition, then you see the two sides of the House go back and forth in terms of trying to sway popular opinion about the legitimacy of either side. So Stephen Harper's argument was, nobody voted for a Liberal NDP coalition. That's not on. If you people want to run the government, if you people want to overthrow us, then go to election and be elected as a Liberal NDP coalition. The Liberal side was, it is absolutely within the rights of Parliament to defeat a government and choose another one. And so both had a point, right? Like, I mean, on some level, of course, it's the role of Parliament to choose a government and to pledge support for a government. And Parliament is absolutely within its rights to say, we don't want this government anymore, we want this one. And the Prime Minister is the MP who holds the confidence of the House, regardless of the partisan screwing around or however they machine it. It doesn't matter, right? Like the MP who holds the confidence of the House is the Prime Minister. However, to be a parliamentary purist is not always helpful, right? Like you can't just say, I think in this day and age, that what's going on outside the walls of Parliament, if no one in the public really voted for this, if there's no public support for this, how can you kind of push this through for years? And so I think Andrew Coyne, fantastic, called the Liberal NDP coalition, the proposed coalition, a rickety contraption. And so how can we put that forward as the government if nobody supported it, right? So like there was a really interesting, dramatic kind of argument about what was right? Like what the parliamentary choice was and where the popular opinion was. And that made that decision, that particular, that kind of turn of events really dramatic on the constitutional front.
Do you think that's why Michaela Jean acquiesced to that?
I don't know why I don't know why she made the decision she made. I wouldn't presume that, although I do think I can see, and I'm just hypothesizing here, I can see why if the argument had been brought to her that there is a very rife situation and a prorogation is not a final decision, a prorogation is a pause button. And if it means that much to the opposition to defeat the government, they'll do it when they come back.
All right, good point.
You know what I mean? Like there's kind of like, okay, let everybody just kind of cool the jets for a few minutes. And if you really want to sack these guys, then we will tee up that opportunity when you all come back after prorogation. And they did not, actually, because the Liberals decided to replace their leader. Dion left, Ignatieff came in, and everybody went their merry way. Ish.
For a while.
Or not.
For a while, that's for sure. Yeah. Now, Tim, I had asked you earlier about it being hypocritical of the Liberals to, obviously complaining about Harper and go ahead and do it. They have a minority government. And their claim on this last December's throne speech, much different than the reality we have now. I'm going to guess you're going to buy that part.
Yeah.
But who do they have to play with to actually get this through?
That's a really good question. I think they're banking on playing with the NDP. I think that's really who they're looking to. we can already see the Conservatives trying to undercut that before Parliament coming back, saying that putting out lines like the government is going to, I think some were saying that are going to take part in social engineering and completely changing the Canadian state, and that we have to be careful and watch out. And they're basically lining it up to attack the Liberals over increased social spending, supports for people who've been hit the hardest by the COVID-19 pandemic, and looking, I think, at the legitimate calls to see what some of these, how some of these, ostensibly temporary measures might become longer-term measures. So, for example, the NDP MP Leah Gazan has proposed that CERB be transformed essentially into a permanent universal basic income type program. So I think they're going to be looking to the NDP to support them. I think they're going to try to enact some, hopefully, significant social programs that, I think some of the people who originally supported a Trudeau-led Liberal Party, even back in 2015, thought this would be what the Liberals would bring forward. It's unfortunate it's taken a pandemic and a crisis to maybe push them to do that. But I think there's some hope that'll happen now. We'll see how far it goes. But I think it'll be the NDP that they look to. Perhaps the Bloc Québécois, but I think that there's still some lingering tensions there between the parties. And I don't think they're going to necessarily go to the Bloc on this one.
You think it'll be the NDP, Laurie?
Yeah, because I think the Bloc have already kind of carved out a space for themselves where they don't want to be that person. They don't want to be that partner. They're not necessarily saying we will never work with the Liberals ever. They haven't gone there, but they're you can see that Blanchet has kind of distanced himself from the Liberals, not ideologically, but kind of on this we issue where he's saying, we want the Prime Minister to resign. We want Chrystia Freeland to be Prime Minister. It's like, okay, but like they've kind of created a scenario where they're not just kind of lining up to play ball with the government. And I can see from their perspective why they don't want to be in the position of doing that. Obviously, the Bloc Québécois is not ever going to have enough seats to be a contender to government. And that's not their ideological or existential goal. And so they can only, they're playing in a different kind of space than the other parties are. Obviously, the point of the Conservatives is not to support the government. They're the official opposition. The Greens aren't big enough, so that leaves the NDP. And I think they're in a difficult spot too, in the sense that if they look to be too much supportive of what the government is doing, they're in an existential crisis going forward. And so if the government, I think that the election of Erin O'Toole, the selection of Minister Freeland as finance minister, creates a very interesting debate between the two parties about how Canada should go forward post-COVID. And I think if the Liberals swing left, which they are probably going to do, what is the existential purpose of the NDP? And that will be Jagmeet Singh's question for the election going forward, is what do we need you for? If the Liberals are able to do business with you, if the finance minister is kind of going more left than Morneau did, and O'Toole is running up the center right, like then where does the NDP come into play?
Yeah,
if I could add,
sure, go ahead, Tim.
If I could just add it, I think I think it does present a crisis for the NDP, but perhaps an opportunity to really differentiate themselves and push the Liberals to go even further and show the impact that they can have in a minority government, to get some better policies put in place and stake their ground. I don't think we've seen them do that, though, and so this could be an opportunity for them to do that. I think there's a lot of people who are looking for that kind of progressive change that would be really supportive, and I think it could help, solve some of that existential crisis that Laura's talking about.
Now, we got a posting on our Facebook page from the podcast we did on proroguing. It was from June Green. Wasn't aware Harper prorogued Parliament more than once when the opposition parties tried to form a coalition. But she asked, whenever Parliament isn't in session, does that not mean it's been prorogued? And Laurie, that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, Parliament can have scheduled breaks. Mm-hmm. And so that's the norm, right? And in the summertime, for instance, right? Like Parliament will have a calendar, and you can download that. And if you're on the Hill, you can get a nifty little pocket calendar that has the green days and the white days, and you can see when they're sitting and when they're not. But Parliament comes up with a calendar, and they can actually have a number of weeks that they don't sit, and it's not a prorogation. It's just they're having a break, and that can happen for the summer, that can happen for Easter, Christmas, whatever holiday.
Right.
And like the difference is if Parliament is just on and off week, in the sense that parliamentarians are in their ridings rather than in Ottawa, the work of committees doesn't stop, like bills don't stop. It's just like kind of everybody's just sort of taking a break. Whereas a prorogation means committees don't meet, any piece of legislation that was in progress actually stops and has to start again. A government legislation has to start again from point one when the House reconvenes. And so it's a much more impactful, stopping of things, whereas Parliament can break without proroguing.
Tim, voter apathy is a big problem in Canada right now. Has been for quite a while. And I brought up cynicism at the beginning of the show, and perhaps I'm a little bit cynical being around politics this long. But do you think that seeing something like this is what sort of drives younger voters away and just sort of keeps people jaded about politics when he pulls out the prorogation because the wee scandal's getting a little hot?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's prorogation. I think, this time around, prorogation, I think people don't really understand what it is. They just see another government trying to avoid accountability. And I think that's what really drives it. So whether it's prorogation, whether it's other attempts to, shut down debate, putting closure on bills, breaking promises that they previously made, even if it has nothing to do with, with not proroguing Parliament. I think that's what drives voter apathy. And I think we've seen that with the Liberals. I think there's still the real sting of not bringing in electoral reform. That was a major promise that they made, and they didn't need prorogation to not do that. And I think that really caused a lot of voter apathy and a lot of cynicism towards what this new look Liberal Party was supposed to bring. I think people get frustrated with opposition parties that don't push hard enough to keep the government to account, or who go into, I think, we could say, a kind of over the top theatrics around how to keep the government in account, and people see that. And I think it's a kind of performative kind of work by MPs that can also drive apathy. So I think people are upset that they're proroguing to avoid the wee scandal, but I think people are also smart enough that when it's made out to be the biggest scandal that's the government has faced, it clearly isn't, and there's other priorities that need to be on the front burner. I think that also drives the voter apathy as well.
Laurie, has the Governor General ever refused to grant prorogation?
I don't think so.
No.
The only time that we ever talk about really that a Governor General refused a request from a Prime Minister was 1926, when the Governor General refused the request from Prime Minister Mackenzie King to dissolve Parliament. And kind of similar situation in the sense that the Prime Minister knew he was facing a confidence vote that he was going to lose. He was in a minority government situation, but he wasn't asking to pause. He was asking to purge. And so the Governor General said no and asked the Leader of the Opposition to form a government. And he lasted a very short period of time. And then when it looked like there was nobody who could hold the confidence of the House, they had to go to election. And Mackenzie King, who had originally asked for the dissolution, won a majority.
What would it take to get prorogation out of either Canadian politics? Well, it's in the Constitution, right?
No. There would be no constitutional implication to not proroguing. It would be a political pressure kind of thing. I mean, prorogation is something that the Prime Minister can use and that Prime Minister can ask for. But I mean, would we have to change the Constitution to ban prorogation? Not really, right? Like,
No.
I mean, there's so much of our Constitution that is open to, that is about unwritten convention, right? And so if it just fell into disuse to the point where it was politically disastrous to use it, I think that would probably be enough. And so that's a political call. Like, can you tell, I mean, if you really wanted to, if you want to put it in the Constitution to ban prorogation, okay, fine.
Right.
But is that the right way to go? Is that the most effective way to go? Probably not. I think more likely would be a kind of political reality that people didn't accept this as a legitimate thing for a Prime Minister to do. But but I would say
Yeah.
most voters don't make that kind of, like, that's not the be all and end all of most people's vote. People are voting about jobs, economy, healthcare. They're not voting on whether a prime minister prorogues or not. And at the end of the day, even if people think that Justin Trudeau's a jerk for having done this, this is going to affect people's vote. Probably not.
No, all right. Well, I want to thank you both for joining. Well, I guess all three of us now. Dr. Laurie Turnbull, director of the School of Public Administration, as well an associate professor in political science at Dalhousie University, and Tim McSorley is the national coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. And I want to thank you both for joining us on Unpublished TV, and I want to thank you for joining us. Have yourself a great evening. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.